Hi everyone, and welcome to Make Exceptional Landscapes Happen. That's going to be our subject today. I'm Joe Brady, and today we're going to explore how to get the most out of your camera so you can get the absolute best single shot capture of a landscape. Now, of course, there are many elements that contribute to a wonderful landscape photograph, but getting the best possible exposure and data possible right at capture is important for the quality of the final image. So why do we care about getting the best possible digital file? Can't you just bracket away? One of them is going to have to be pretty good, right? Can't you just fix it in Lightroom or Photoshop later? Well, in some instances, these methods might work, provided you've got a lot of storage space and lots of time to both sort through lots of image files you can't use and lots of time to do edits in software. Even after all that, you're still probably not getting all the data that your camera can capture. Let's talk about bracketing first. Prior to putting my Sekonic 758 meter through the DTS process, something we're going to see in detail in a few minutes, I used to bracket in an attempt to get the perfect exposure. Then I'd have to download and sort through all of the images to try and pick out the best one. Now this is actually a difficult process for many landscape images because of how the cameras map out tones when you're dealing with a high contrast image. That means that the best digital file, meaning the one that will edit best, may not look the best at first glance. You'll need to take a close look at the histogram of each possibility and determine if it offers the best range of data. Wouldn't it be nice to have just a few files to sort through? Wouldn't it be nice to simply make your choices by the patterns of light in the scene and the composition? The process we're going to explore today lets that happen. Now, the next consideration is, how about just fixing it in Photoshop or Lightroom? Now, there's no escaping the fact that the more editing you do in software, the more damage you're going to do to the clarity, noise, color, and fine gradations in your image. While it's true that the editing process is very important to bring out the beauty of our images, we want to limit that editing to shaping the tone and color curves of the data while causing as little harm as possible. Now, our cameras all have their own ideas as to what we want the image to look like. They really have no idea what you're pointing at. They've got built-in default contrast curves and color settings that in most cases desaturate color and increase the contrast. Now this might work just fine for well-lit scenes with limited contrast, but when you're working with a dramatic scene containing bright whites and dark shadows, the camera usually fails. It might get close, but that's where software comes in. Now today we're going to explore in detail how to use a light meter. I've got my buddy here, the 758. To give us the best possible capture in this type of scene. We're going to calibrate and profile the meter to a specific camera, in my case, a Sony Alpha 99. Now, since every camera has different capabilities with tonal range and color, and since every manufacturer has its own idea of what a middle exposure or middle gray should be, the process of creating an exposure profile for your camera tells the meter exactly what the camera's capabilities are. Now this sounds like it could be complicated, but it's actually very simple. All you need to do is take 3 shots of a target at 3 different exposures and load them into the software. To do that, we're going to use a tool you should probably have anyway. This is X-Rite's Color Checker Passport. This will allow us not only to create a custom camera color profile, but an exposure profile that we can then load into the meter. So let's take a look how to do this as we set the groundwork for creating that camera exposure profile. We're here at Dingman's Falls in Pennsylvania. This is the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. And we're here today to really dial in with the Sekonic 758 and the Sekonic DTS software. What the DTS software does is it allows the meter to learn the full dynamic range of your camera as well as what it sees as middle gray. When the meter has this information, you can then explore the scene and find the full tonal range, the brightest highlights, the deepest shadows, so that you can capture the best digital file possible. Now, in the past, this required a specialized target, which, by the way, is still available, but now you can use a Color Checker Passport to do the entire custom camera exposure profile with the DTS software. I've got the Sekonic version of the X-Rite Color Checker here. This has got an 18% gray card, a white card, and then our 2 color targets. So we're going to use this to create the DTS profile for this camera. Now the clouds just moved in. We're hoping it's going to get sunny later, but this is actually perfect conditions to create a profile for the camera. because we have very even light. It's like having a big softbox here, and it's going to allow our exposures to be nice and easy. So let's go ahead and through the process. I want you to see how easy it is, and then we're going to put it to use, and you're going to see how powerful it is. Before we start, it's important that we set the meter to read in tenths of a stop. Now, you might prefer to work in a third of a stop. We'll set it back there later. But to do that, we have to go into the custom settings. To get there, hold in the mode button, press the power button, and you see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, it says CS for custom settings, and we have 1, 1. We want to rotate the jog wheel until we get 3. Now, we want to set 3 to 0, which is tenths of a stop. So I hit the mode button and it will cycle through the choices until we get to 0. Now we can power off, and when we power back on, and now when we take our readings, the meter is going to be in tenths of a stop. While we're here, let's adjust 2 other custom settings that we're going to use later. Now the first one is custom function 1. This lets us set the ISO 2 button to be a compensation or filter adjustment. So we want this to be 1, just hit the mode button once, and that's 1. The other one we want to adjust is 17. So I'm going to spin the other way until we get to 17. And we want 17 to be 2. What this does is it automatically switches the memory and the measurement button depending on if we're on the incident or spot meter. I find that when I have the meter switched for spot metering, which is this right here, that it's easier to take the measurement using this button because you're kind of holding it like a trigger. So 17.2, power off, power back on, and now when we take a reading, let me go back to incident, we take a reading here, you can see now we're in tenths. And we need this for the DTS software, so let's go ahead and do that. Now the first thing we need to do when we're doing the measurements for the DTS software is we need to take both an incident and a spot reading with the 18% gray card. Now even though it's cloudy, there is kind of a bright dome above me, so I do want to mask it a little bit. I don't want to have that bright kind of specular sun that's trying to peek through the clouds influencing the reading on the dome. So I'm just going to place my hand in between the direct sun and the dome, get my reading, and I'm getting f4 and 7/10. I'm at a 60th of a second at 100 ISO. Great. So I need to remember that. My incident reading is 4 and 7/10. Then I switch over to spot metering, and I take a reading off of the card here. And I get f4 and 6/10. They're just a tenth of a stop off. That's not unusual. In fact, with the first time you do this, you may find that your meter is a half a stop or even a little bit more off. When we run this through the DTS software, it's going to get rid of that. It's going to calibrate the spot meter to the incident meter, and everything will be good. So now we're ready to start to take our shots of the color target. Oh, by the way, if you don't have this iconic version of the color checker and you just have a standard color checker, don't worry, I'm actually going to put it upside down. You can actually read off of the 4th patch in with the spot meter. This is also 18% gray, and the 1 degree spot meter on the 758 can handle that. So I can do the same thing here, just zoom in, find that gray, and I get exactly the same reading, 4 and 6/10. So we know that's our reading, 4 and 7/10 for incident, 4 and 6/10 for our reflective or spot metering. So now we can go ahead and get our shots to create the profile. So I've switched my meter back to thirds of a stop. The reason for that is because that's what my camera tells me. And again, to do that, custom function 3, set it to, I forget, 1. Custom function 3, set it to 1. So I'm going to take my reading again for my incident, and what I want to do, so it gives me the most flexibility, is I want my incident aperture to be f8. That'll come into play in the software later. So I'm going to hold over again my hand to mask the bright of the overhead, and I get 30th of a second at f8. That's a good number. Now if my shutter speed had been different, let's say I was at that 60th of a second, it gives me 5/6, I can just spin the dial down to a 30th and I get f8. So a 30th of a second at f8 at 100 ISO is my perfect exposure for this target. So let's get that shot. So I've got the color checker framed in here. I've got a 30th of a second at f8 at 100 ISO on my camera. I can just go ahead and take that shot. That's going to be my perfect exposure. I need to take 2 more shots. I need to take one 3 stops open and 3 stops closed from this number. So let's do the open first, and we're going to do it with shutter speed, not with aperture. We're going to leave the f8 alone. So I need to open up 3 stops from a 30th of a second. Well, 1 stop's 15th of a second, 2 stops is an 1/8 of a second, 3 stops is a 1/4 of a second. We're just gonna half it each time. So 1/4 of a second at f8 will be my 3 stops open. So I set that at 1/4. And there's my 3 stops open. And now I'm gonna go 3 stops closed. So 30th, 60th is 1 stop, 125 is 2 stops, 250 is 3 stops. Again, we're just gonna double the time each for that. So again, staying on F8, let's go up to 250th of a second, and that will be 3 stops closed down from that 30th of a second. So by having these 3 exposures, the perfect one, way overexposed, way underexposed, the software is going to be able to plot out the response of the sensor. So it's going to give us information, the entire tonal range of the camera, including the clipping points, where we would lose highlights and shadows, as well as telling us what this camera thinks middle gray is. And middle gray is different on every camera. You could have 2/3 of a stop difference, but just between different camera models. So by knowing exactly what middle gray is, that gives us that perfect starting point. By knowing the dynamic range, by knowing the entire tonal range of this camera, that will again get programmed and loaded into the meter so that when I take a spot meter reading, I'll know exactly how far I can push those highlights to the edge before they start to clip. And that's going to give me the best digital capture possible. So we've got our shots. Next thing to do is to put them in the software and create our profile and then load it into the meter. All right, so we're pretty well on our way to being able to use the meter to get all of our perfect captures. But before we go any further, a couple of questions, and this is a good one. Someone asked, why such a cryptic interface in this day and age? How will I remember 17 has to be 2 in the field? Good point. Keep in mind, though, we're so enamored with all this digital technology. There are certain things that are actually much faster for your brain to process, for you to see when it's analog, not digital. Think of a clock. It's much easier to just glance at a clock and say it's 3 o'clock than to see 3.300 on an interface. To that end, however, when you can't remember all the numbers, when you get a 758 meter, you get a little cheat sheet. It's a little card with a sticker that you just put on the back of your battery cover, and all 17 of the possibilities are sitting right there. So you don't have to remember it. The only one you're probably going to change, however, is the tenths to the thirds of a stop readings. That's the only one I ever touch. Really, the others, once you set them, you're going to leave them alone. I do use tenths when I'm taking those measurements to get the ambient and the incident readings. After that, it gets put back to thirds so that it matches my camera, and I don't have to think about what 5.6 and 7/10 really translates to in my camera. So just got to remember one, or use the sticker on the back of the meter. Another question somebody asked about when I was showing blocking out that speck of sun on the dome, saying, will I cast a shadow on the dome? Do you cast a shadow over the whole dome or just on the part of the dome which has the speck of the sun and leave the other part in direct light? All you need to do is cover up that really bright specular highlight. Keep in mind, as you think of the sun as being giant, which it is, but it's really far away. So it's a point light source. It's a really tiny little light source. We just don't want that speck, that one little hot spot, from influencing the reading. Because if you do leave that speck on the dome, you're going to probably end up underexposing a 1/2 to 2/3 of a stop. So just by having your finger covering just where the speck is and let the rest of the ambient light hit the dome, it really does a good job. So yes, it's okay if it hits the rest of the dome. I've just found that I want to cover that speck up. Someone asked, do you need to have sharp focus when you take a picture of the color checker? You need relatively sharp focus, because what happens is when the software goes in and finds each of the colors, it uses the grid to separate them out. So you don't have to be tack sharp, you can be a little bit off, but you need to see those clearly delineated black lines in between each of the patches so the software can find them. Someone mentioned that they don't have a 758, they have a 308S. How do you spot meter with one of these? First of all, the DTS software doesn't work with the 308. So the 308 is a great meter. It's primarily an incident meter. There are attachments, but they're not 1-degree spot attachments. You can use a meter like that in concert with your camera. If on most cameras, on a full frame camera, If you want to get a 1-degree spot, you need to set your camera to spot metering, and about 133 millimeter, I'm sorry, somewhere 160 millimeters about will give you a 1-degree reading. If you have a crop frame camera, it's something around 130 or so will give you a 1-degree reading. It becomes more manual. You're going to have to add and subtract f-stops in your head, but it's a way around it. If you find yourself running into this a lot, really consider investing in the meter, because when you're out in the field, it just makes it really easy. I just got back from a long weekend up in the Adirondacks, and I just took one of my lower end cameras because I wasn't going to do any shooting. It was supposed to be a relaxing, no computer weekend. But of course, I ended up going out and shooting with my Sony RX10, which is my kind of all-purpose video still camera. And I didn't have my meter with me, and I was shooting some waterfalls. And I was kicking myself that I didn't have it with me, because I ended up having to bracket. I hate bracketing. So consider getting a meter. All right, that's it with the questions for now. Remember, if you joined us late, take advantage of the chat room. We'll come back and take some more questions in a little bit. So we just finished getting the images and measurements. So we have everything we need necessary to create a profile that tells the meter exactly what the camera is capable of. The next step is to load the images that we shot of the Color Checker Passport into the free DTS or data transfer software. And again, it's available for free on Sekonic.com. This software allows you to create as many exposure profiles as you like. You may also want to create profiles for different ISOs, because most cameras, as you get up higher, 1600 or above, you start to lose a little bit of tonal range. Now, you can create as many profiles as you like, but the meter can hold up to 3 profiles at any one time. You can always change the selection of profiles by connecting the meter to your computer with a USB cable. There's a little port right on the side here that you plug into. But I've rarely found that I need more than 2 available on any particular shooting trip. So let's start up the software and create an exposure profile for our shoot. All right, let's start up the DTS software. And what we're going to do is create a new profile. So we just click on here where it says create new profile. We're just going to use our quick mode. And notice it tells us here we can use the X-Ray Color Checker target. We're using a passport, so we tell it that. Click on next. And if you remember, we had those incident and spot readings that we were dealing with before. We need to put those same numbers in. And if you remember from the video, our incident reading was at 100 ISO. Our shutter speed was a 60th of a second. The incident reading was f4 and 7/10. So we put that in. Our reflected reading, also at a 60th of a second, was f4 at 6/10. Click on next. And now it's going to ask us to load up the 3 exposures. And I've got them here. I called it in a little folder called Color Checker Passport for DTS. Now, if you shoot RAW, which I did, I brought these into Lightroom first and then just exported them as JPEGs into a separate folder. So I click Open, and it loads the 3 of them in. And I do want all 3 of these. Kind of a little hard to see. A little green arrow appears there. And if I click on the first one, I get to see there it is. And it sees from the metadata all the exposure. We see it was f8, and it was a 30th of a second and 100 ISO. Then I can click on next, and it's going to tell me to go ahead and select one of these and tell it where the corners of the target are. So I hit OK, and I just click on these little crosshairs and drag them to the 4 corners so that the software can easily find where all the color patches are. So once that's done, since this was shot on a tripod, the others will automatically line up. I can just click on each of them and they automatically line up. If by chance you did this handheld, you might have to go in and replace these crosshairs manually for each one. So now I click on next, and it's going to do its calculation. And here's the fun part. Here's our beautiful graph, and we can see the overlaps. So here's our middle exposure, here's our highlight exposure, and here's our shadow exposure. Now the software calculates out the tonal range of the camera. We could be done here, but we're not going to be done here because this is extremely safe. In fact, it's maybe ridiculously safe. If you take a look at the numbers here, it's plotting out the dynamic range. Instead of from 0 to 255, which would be our full data, it's clipping or stopping the dynamic range at 245 and at 20
for our shadows, and it's clipping at 230 and 35. This is way, way, way too conservative, because you can see that the graph is fully going all the way out, much further than it's telling us. We're going to call it the dynamic range edge. So what we're going to first do is just click and save this, and I'll call it Dingman's Creek, since this is where we were going to do our shoot, and it's for an alpha 99. Hit OK. And then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to edit the profile. So we're going to change the exposure range of the Dingman's Creek alpha 99. All right, so it loads in our data, and again, we see these sliders, but we can see that the camera was actually capturing much more. And 245 is, to me, way too conservative when 255 would be clipping. So I'm not even going to go to 255, but I am going to go to 250 and set that as a dynamic range. And it tells me from that that means from the middle gray, which it plotted out right here, that this camera can safely capture 3.8 stops up from that middle gray. Now the clipping point is set for 230. Again, to me, way too conservative. This is what I would probably put at 245. So I'll go ahead and put that in there. Now it says the midtone is set for 118. That is a standard. Now the dynamic range on the bottom end, we've got 20, where 0 would be obviously be technically completely black. I'm going to come down to about 15. Okay, that's closer to the edge. And then for our clipping point, I will stay somewhat conservative on there because I don't want to lay a lot of noise into my shadows or let that creep in and think that I'm safe. So I'm going to put that at 25. So we can see now that our tonal range of the camera is 3.8 stops up from the middle gray and 5.1 stops down from the middle gray. Now we have our clipping points as our safety margins. We've got 10 points from our clipping point to the absolute clip, and then we have 25 points on the shadow side. When we go out in the field, we're just going to set that highlight clipping point at 3 stops from our middle gray, and we'll see this put to action in a little bit. So rather than click save, you click on back and then it asks you what you want to do. Just tell it to overwrite, and here is that profile. So I'm going to restart the data transfer software. I've got it plugged into my meter. It's communicating with the meter. It sees what profiles are currently in there. And I already have it in there, but what I would do is click on the profile, click on transfer it over. It'll put that in slot 1. Click on transfer to light meter. Yes, I'm going to overwrite it. It's going to transfer that into the meter. And then when it's done, you'll see, okay. And now the profile we just created is now in position 1. And on the meter, how you access the 3 profiles is hold in ISO 1, push the midtone button, and it will cycle through camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. We want to be on camera 1 for the new profile we just created. Now that we've got our custom profile, let's get out in the field and capture some great landscapes.
All right, a couple questions, including a couple of snarky ones, but I appreciate those, so thank you. Someone asked, it's a good question, and I actually don't know the answer. I have to look it up for you. Someone asked, can you calibrate a camera that's been converted to infrared? I haven't tried that, but actually I don't see why not. The target is still going to find out where you blew out and where your shadows blocked up, so I would guess it would work. If you've got a color checker, just go online, download the software. You get to see that graph, and that graph will tell you if it worked or not. You just want to make sure those 3 line segments that you take kind of match up. If they're really disconnected, then there was a problem. And here's the snarky question. Somebody wanted to know, hey Joe, how much interference do you get from that shirt? Making fun of my shirt. I wanted to keep a little continuity. For some reason I wore this shirt when we were out shooting. And you might be wondering what's with the black pictures behind me. Well, this shirt is going to happen to blend in very nicely with these pictures, but I'll reveal them at the end because they're going to be 2 of the finished shots from the final edit, and I want you to see those, but I just don't want to give away the surprise yet. Someone asked, what white balance did I use to take a picture of the color checker? Good question. However, I was shooting in RAW, so technically the white balance didn't matter. Yes, I then exported those files from Lightroom as JPEGs to bring into the DTS software. So technically my white balance when I did the capture, since it was a RAW, didn't matter. If I was not shooting RAW, if you were shooting JPEGs, you should custom white balance first. And again, I happen to have, this is the Sekonic version of the X-Rite color checker, because on the opposite side from the color targets, I've got two targets here. This is a white balance target, which is a very light gray, and this is an 18% gray target. So if you're going to shoot JPEGs, white balance off of this first to get a custom white balance. If you're shooting in RAW, just approximate. If it's cloudy out, use cloudy. It doesn't really matter because you're going to white balance in software before you export those JPEGs. But good point. If you're shooting JPEGs, you definitely want to white balance first. A couple of you asked about where can they get that sticker I mentioned. And that sticker I mentioned that I have on the battery cover on the back of the meter. If you bought a meter, you got the sticker, it was in the box, there's a good chance it got lost, it was thrown away with the packaging or something. I'm gonna look into see how we can get those for you. Actually, when we take our next video break, what I'll do is you can download the 758 manual from the Sekonic.com site, and when we take our break, I'll look up and I'll tell you exactly what page has a reproduction of all the information that is actually on that sticker. Someone said, do you need to have sharp focus when taking a picture of the gray card? No. Doesn't matter. Here's a good question, and you're actually led up to this because I'm actually going to talk about this right at the end. What about HDR? Don't you have to take multiple exposures to build an HDR image? Yes, if you're going to do HDR. What's remarkable about the scenes that we were dealing with, though, even though they look like they might require HDR, you're going to see that they don't, and you're going to see that when we go in the Lightroom and do the edit. Our next session that we do involving this meter, though, we're going to go into HDR. What happens if you hit a scene that is beyond the capability of your camera? Now, as I mentioned again, I shoot with the Sony Alpha 99, and one of the reasons I do is because this camera and the Nikon D800 share the same sensor. Sony makes the sensors for those cameras. Currently, of all the DSLRs that I've seen, these cameras have the greatest tonal range with their sensor. So it has to get pretty extreme before I'm going to be out of range. However, with some of my other cameras, they don't have the tonal range of this camera, so HDR did come into play. In our next session, I will go into how to meter highlights and shadows and calculate exactly how many shots you need for an HDR and what they need to be exposure-wise. We're going to do our HDR, however, very realistic when we get there. None of the kind of the grungy effects that HDR became popular with for a while. I'll show you both a manual way to do it and an automatic way to do it using different softwares, but that's the next session. Someone asked also, do you have to reprofile for different light conditions? The answer to that really is no. Once you create an exposure profile for a particular ISO, what you're doing is you're just finding out what the camera's tonal range is. And we do that by doing those 3 different exposures. It does work best if you're in the shade rather than sun. That's not a good idea. The shade just gives you that nice even light that allows you to get the 3 stops up and down to create a great profile. Now, a couple other tools that I was using while I was out there, by the way. In order to slow down the water, I was using a neutral density filter, which actually you're going to see in just a minute. I used a 3-stop ND filter. This is also called a 0.9. And before the question comes up, I have had people ask me if there's a color shift when you do this. And I did find out in a previous webinar, and we'll send you the link to that one as well, when I did a custom color profile with the ND filter and compared it with and without, there really was no change. So that means that red, green, and blue light on this particular ND filter was evenly transmitted. So no color shifts there. Other thing also, you might have noticed my tripod. Again, my favorite traveling tripod. This is a Benro Travel Angel. It's a carbon fiber tripod. It's incredibly light. Really, if you're going to be hiking a lot and shooting a lot, it's very sturdy. It'll handle a big camera with a big lens, but it weighs practically nothing. All right, so we're going to get ready for our shoot. Because we can do that now, because now our meter knows exactly what the camera is capable of capturing and also knows what the camera's middle is. Now, while Phil from Sekonic hates when I do this and I anthropomorphize my meter, but this meter's my buddy. In essence, what I did was I taught my meter to see light just like my camera does. With the meter's advanced calculating functions, I can now take measurements of my brightest highlights, the mid-tone, and shadows, and have the meter give me all the information I need to make a great capture. Now, before this comes up, you may ask, what if I'm shooting wildlife or birds in flight? I don't have time to do all of that. I've been on bird shoots. I photographed white egrets in flight on several occasions, and it's easier than you might think. Yes, you're not going to do it when the bird's actually in flight. All you need to do is first spot meter off of some white plumage that is sunlit. So just get your reading of that bird in the sun. Then use that reading to get your perfect exposure. Then just set it and forget it. Unless, of course, you have a big light change, clouds move in, it goes cloudy. You can just go ahead and shoot, knowing that your exposure will capture the widest tonal range possible in a single capture. Put those highlights as far to the right in the histogram without clipping them. Now, since we're basing this session on a landscape shoot, we're going to head out to one of my favorite places and put the meter and its exposure profile to work. We're going to head back to Dingman's Falls. It's near Milford, Pennsylvania, right on the Delaware River in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. Now, we were back there in the fall, but the conditions were very different from our last visit. We had just had over about 5 inches of rain, and the gentle, peaceful falls were now torrential cascades. The challenge, however, was the same, so let's go shoot and put the meter to work. The exposure profile for my camera is now loaded into the meter. How do I access it? Pretty easy. If you look on the screen, I'll show you this close just in a second, it says camera 1 right on the screen. Now there's 3 choices. You can have 3 loaded into here. Even though you can create more in software, the meter can hold up to 3 different profiles at a time. So I just hold in ISO 1 and then tap in the mode button, and it cycles through camera 2, camera 3. Now camera 1's where I put my profile for this camera, so that's what I'm going to use. So when you arrive at a scene, take a look around and see what's going on. If we look over to this way, we've got Dingman's Falls, and it is absolutely a raging torrent. I'll show you some images we shot last time we were here, where it's a much gentler stream. It's just raging right now. And even though it's mostly overcast, the white water, because of the ragingness of it, is that a word, ragingness? Is really, really bright. And what we want to do is pursue something that is also called shooting to the right. I want to take the brightest white in that water and push it as far to the right of the exposure as I can without clipping it. Once you clip it, it's gone. There's no bringing it back. Yes, in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, you can bring readings that are above 255 back, but once they hit 255, there's no detail. So if I were to bring them down, I'm just going to get light gray with no detail in it. I want to maintain detail, which means none of that can go past 255. Now, according to my profile, when I looked at it, my camera could actually capture from its middle gray about 4.5 stops up and down, which is a lot. But what I set my clipping point at was at 3.5 stops. That gives me some wiggle room. I'm going to be even a little safer here because there is some variability in the clouds. I'm going to set it so that I can open up 3 stops. So here's the procedure. I have the meter on spot metering. When we did that custom setting 17, it switched the function of the memory and the measuring buttons. So right now the memory button for spot metering is the measuring button. That just makes it more of a pistol grip kind of thing. I can look through and use my pointer finger to take that reading. And what you do is look through here and just hold this in. And as you look through, you'll see in the meter the reading that you get. So as I point through here, I can scan around and I look for the absolute brightest thing I get, and I'm getting at 60th of a second at 100 ISO f18. Now that reading puts that brightest thing as middle gray. We don't want it there. We want it all the way to the right without clipping. Now remember I said earlier, I know that I can safely open up 3 stops from there. So that's where the ISO 2 button comes in that we changed earlier to that filter compensation. I just hold in the ISO 2 button, I spin the dial until it shows me 3. That'll put those whites right at the right without clipping them. Now that's assuming I just want to do a straight exposure. I want to have this water have a little bit more of a flow. So let's go ahead and do a shot first at a 60th of a second at 6.3, and then we're going to slow the shutter speed down. I want to get down to somewhere between 1/3 and 3 seconds to get some flow out of this water. So to do that, we're going to have to slow the shutter speed down, increase the aperture, and we're going to have to put on a neutral density filter. Let's do it without that first. Here's a 60th of a second at 6.3. Now, according to my camera's meter, that was 2 stops overexposed, which is fine because it's correct. Remember, it's pointing mostly at that white. So depending on how you frame it, your camera's meter is going to be all over the place. Don't trust it, trust this. So now I want to adjust the shutter speed. I want to start to get some flow out of the water as I get the bugs off of me. I'm going to bring the shutter speed down. Let's see how far I can go. I mentioned I want to get it down to, a third of a second or slower. Now at a third of a second, it's f81, but again, that's without the adjustment for the exposure to put that whites to the right. If I hold down my 3 stops, that still puts me at f29. That's too much. I'm gonna need some help. I need to put a neutral density filter on here, and I brought one with me. I brought a 3-stop neutral density filter, which will cut down the light by 3 stops. So let's put that on and see what it gives us. So we just put a 0.9 ND filter on the camera. 0.9 means it's a 3-stop reduction. So I need to reduce another 3 stops or open up another 3 stops on my exposure from what we had. Now, if you remember, we spun the dial, so we got 3. Well, the meter can only compensate up to 5 stops. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna hold in the ISO 2 button, and I'm gonna spin the dial all the way up to its 5. So that will tell me what I would need to do to open up 5 stops. We actually need to open up 6. 3 to push the whites to the right, 3 for the ND filter. So I'm at 1.6 seconds. I want to have a longer exposure. And when I hold in my ISO 2 button, it tells me that puts me at f22. However, that's for 5 stops. I need to add 1 more stop, which means I need to double the time. So instead of 1.6 seconds, it's going to be 3.2 seconds. And guess what? 3.2 is in my camera. So let's take a shot. 3.2 seconds, f22, again, 100 ISO. And that makes for a very cool effect. This raging water over 3 seconds is really flowing. You're getting that sense of time. It's much more silky. It looks really nice compared to stopping the water. And this is all possible. Yes, you could do this trial and error, but light is so fleeting. The whole landscape photography is so fleeting. You need to capture it perfectly because it's going to change every second. So by having this information, this puts me at exactly the right spot. Now I can recompose, I can shoot. I don't have to worry about the exposure. I don't trust what my camera's telling me. My camera's telling me that in that case, I'm about 1.5 stops overexposed because it sees all that white. It's throwing off the reading. Trust the meter. Go through this process, teach the meter how your camera sees light, what it thinks middle gray is, dial in that compensation, and it will be perfect every time. You'll be able to push those highlights to the right, not ever worry about clipping them. Now, sometimes when you do this, the image doesn't look perfect in the camera because of the way your camera's contrast curve is built in. The thing is, however, that we've captured the best digital file possible that's going to make our edits in software really simple. We'll show you that as well. So let's do that. All right, so we had a lot of fun in that shoot, even though it was rather a little bit breezy and the water was torrential. But let's get to some questions first. Someone said, when you load your photos as JPEGs, are you not throwing away a lot of dynamic range? In this case, no, because we're taking shots of something that has very distinct points. It's not a continuous tone kind of image. So we just want to know, what the software is basically looking at is it's looking to see at what point do one of these targets completely disappear. That's how it's going to judge both the highlight clipping and then the shadow blocking up. So it doesn't hurt anything. Another question, somebody asked when I profile my meter, they take an incident reading and get 200th of a second at f8 and 6/10. So they're asking, should I use 200th of a second at f8 or 200ths of a second at f10 for my reading before I take the JPEG shots for the profile? f8 and 6/10 is 1/10 off of f10. It gets a little confusing with the tenths, but if you just think that your camera is set up in thirds of a stop generally, so it'll be f8, f9, f10, f11. So f8 to f9 would be the same as 8 and 3/10. f9 to f10 would actually technically be closer to 7/10. So you're within 1/10 of a stop, it's not going to hurt, but you do want to be accurate. So yes, you'd go f10 at that point. Someone asked about long exposure with a 9 or 10 stop filter. I actually covered that in a previous webinar that we're going to link to. I go over that in detail with the math on how you can calculate it out. Unfortunately, right now, on the 758, it can't show you 9 or 10 stops. It's limited to a 5-stop compensation. So in that other webinar, I went over the math that you can do that's fairly easy that allows you to figure that out. Someone asked, can you calibrate indoors with good daylight to get a profile for outside? Yes, and there's a couple of questions that have come in out of the way, so I'm not explaining something correctly. When you're creating an exposure profile, whether you're outside or inside, it doesn't really matter. What you're doing is you're forcing from your exposures. When you over and underexpose, you're telling the software based on where the detail disappears. So if not only this patch goes all black, but maybe 2 or even 3 in go all black, that's telling the software where the camera is failing. It's beyond the camera's limit. Same thing when you're shooting your overexposed shot. How many of these patches are starting to disappear? This one's gone a full 255, maybe this one has also, and this one's just showing a little data. It's just figuring out what the camera's sensor is capable of. Where you do it, it really doesn't matter. So if you create one inside under different lighting conditions or different white balance, it's not going to have any effect in discovering how the sensor captures light. So that answers the question. Someone asked, do you need a profile different from a cloudy day or a sunny day? Not for the exposure. Now, color is different. And let me clarify. What we're creating today are exposure profiles to load into the meter. There are also profiles that you would use in Lightroom that are custom camera profiles, and they're the things that deal with color. Subject for a different day, that's an X-Rite subject where you create a custom camera profile. In that case, yes, cloudy light is going to be different in its color distribution than a bright sunlight, but that's not what we're talking about today. Let's see. So someone asked, does this mean you have to take your computer along with you and set this all up before you can load all the meter before the actual shoot? No, you don't have to bring it with you. Just at one point, maybe before you leave, do it alongside of your house in full shade. Create the profile. You're teaching the meter how the camera sees light. What's its complete tonal range? What is its middle gray? Once you load that in, you're done. You don't have to create it again. You don't have to carry your computer anywhere. I just happen to do it on location just to show you guys. Someone asked, does white balance not matter if you why does not white balance not matter if you're shooting raw? When you shoot a raw file, you have to understand that nothing has actually been built into that capture yet. White balance hasn't been assigned. A color space hasn't been assigned. Actually, nothing's been assigned. When you bring it into Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, it's going to assign a default. In fact, it's going to assign whatever white balance was in the camera as a starting point. But you can change that because it's just showing you that image if that particular white balance was assigned. Not until you process the raw file does a white balance, a contrast, a sharpness get assigned to the file when you export it as something else. So a raw file really is that. It's just the raw data coming off of the sensor, and none of that stuff has been assigned to it yet. Someone asked, do you need to zero Lightroom import presets to the camera defaults before importing the raw files for the DTS JPEG export? You could do that. The other thing you could do is just select the 3 images, and in the develop module there's a button on the lower right that just says reset, and it will get rid of all those preset that you might have had on import. Someone asked, do you need to profile for each of your lenses? Probably not. That's probably going to be pretty extreme. I have tried it just as an experiment, and I've never seen enough of a difference to bother with. So again, someone asked, can the meter be calibrated with the camera in any location? Yes. Go on the side of your house. Go a nice sunny day, stand in the full shade on the side of your house, do your profile, and once you've done it for that particular ISO, you're done. If you want to create them for different ISOs, again, 100 ISO, maybe 1600 if you shoot high, 3200. Do one for each of those and you'll find some tonal range compression. But again, once you've created those, you don't have to do it again. Someone asked, how many years do you have to change a new color checker? Depends how you treat it. If you're careful with it, it'll last for a good number of years. If you leave this thing open on the dashboard of your car in August in the sun, then all bets are off. So, a couple of years, excuse me. Sorry about that. All right, let's continue on. So we had a fun shoot. Once again, the tonal range in these scenes was extreme. Bright white water and deep shadows on wet rocks. I've taught workshops at various locations and walked around and had some students who were shooting their bracketing, their automatic up and down, 2 stops or even more than that. And I'll take a look at the scene, I'll get my meter out and take a reading. And I'll say, you don't need to bracket that, just a single capture. And they just can't believe it. So I'll show them, I'll get my meter reading of that highlight, take the shot. When we go back and do classroom, I'll bring up that particular image and show them. This is it. You can't judge by what you see on the back of the camera. If you do that, the whites are going to seem to lack detail and even appear to be clipped. And by the way, in cases like these, when you're going close to the edge of your exposure, turning on the highlight warnings on the back of your camera is going to be pretty worthless. This warning has 2 problems. One, it's based on a processed JPEG of the image, not the raw file. 2, it's fairly conservative. It's giving you a warning even when you're getting close and comes on before you actually clip any highlights. Since we trusted our meter with its custom exposure profile, we don't have to worry about this because we know we got the best data possible. To shape the image data back into the scene we saw with our eyes, however, then we need to adjust the data. Since we put our highlights to as far to the right edge of the histogram as possible, we were in fact doing something called shooting to the right. This has the advantage of capturing the most data possible with the least amount of noise and gives us the most latitude and freedom when editing. The edits on images of this type are actually fairly simple, though you can spend more time shaping the light to your liking. Remember, we're making a photograph. We're not just simply taking a snapshot. What I'm going to do is take you now into Adobe Lightroom 5 and show you my approach to these adjustments and enhancements. If you're a Photoshop person, doesn't matter, the process is exactly the same. You would just be using Adobe Camera Raw. All of the sliders and modules are exactly the same. An added benefit here is that once you've made your basic edits, your highlights, shadows, contrast, saturation, and sharpening, you can then apply all of those adjustments to all of the images taken at that location with just one click. And the results are going to be actually right here when you come back. So let's go into the software and we're going to shape the digital captures into beautiful images. I'll show you 2 demonstrations. The first one is a bit more heavy duty and shows some light shaping techniques to focus the viewer into the image. The second one is more subtle because that image didn't need quite as much adjusting. And I don't know if any of you found this, this session this way. If you haven't gotten this yet, this is a Shutterbug special. It's a digital photography how-to guide. It just hit the newsstands last week. And if you look on the back cover, you'll see one of the images that we're going to use along with a link to this actual session. So take a look at this if you haven't gotten it. So let's go into Lightroom and do our edits, and we'll come back and take a look and see what we got. So we've gone through the process with our meter to get the absolute best digital capture we have, yet sometimes when you download your images into your software, in this case in Lightroom, we see that, wow, it just doesn't look that great. Well, why is that? Well, your camera has a certain default tonal curve built into it, and the same thing with saturation. However, with a couple of quick edits I'm going to show you right now, you can turn this into that. It's the same exact file, nothing super heavy lifting was done to it. And then I'm going to show you the exact same type of edit, and I'm going to show you the original capture from our trip last September. This is the image that ended up on the back of the Shutterbug ad, and just take it from here quickly to our final image right there. All of that beauty is in the file. We just need to go ahead and make a couple of basic edits to get that straightened out. Now you look through here, and this is the kind of thing you can get in trouble with your camera, because you look on the back and you think, well, I need to bring the exposure way down because this is all blown out. Well, it really isn't. Take a look at the histogram up here, and you can see, in fact, I'll make this a little bigger. Look at the histogram. We see we've got no clipping. We can turn on the warning highlights for clipping, and there is nothing clipping. We push these whites right to the edge, as you can see right over here, but everything is fine. Conversely, we've got way right down to the black, and there's nothing clipping there. And a lot of times people will see a scene like this and think you need the HDR. Well, you don't. Use the meter, get those highlights right to the right, and you're going to have an amazing amount of tonal range. Now you just need to use the software to shape it.
So here's the process that I use. Everybody has a lot of different ways of accomplishing the same end, but let me show you how I'd attack something like this. First thing, I do want to bring some texture back into those highlights. So in essence, I need to cut down on the camera's contrast curve. I'm going to bring the highlights way down. And just by doing that, look what's happened. Now we have all this beautiful detail in the water. It was always there. It was just because it was in the highlights. It was at the top of the camera's contrast curve, and it was kind of making them all mush together. Now the next thing I like to do to see where I'm going to need to add my sharpening, my localized contrast adjustments, is I'll bring up the clarity on something like this. And an image like this can oftentimes stand a lot of clarity. Good. Same thing with saturation. When you have a desaturated scene to start with, your camera does seem to lose a lot of it, so let's bring that up as well. So we can bring it to the ridiculous and see it looks a little cartoonish. Let's back it off somewhat. And then lastly, and this is a subjective thing for the mood, so I think I'll bring the color temperature down just a little bit more. I think somewhere right around 5,000 is going to be where I want to be. Yeah, 5,081, that's good. And we're already far on our way, because let me hide my right panel here, and you can see already left to right, before and after, we're in a lot better shape. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to do a little bit of light shaping. Now this is something you don't have control of out in nature, so I'm going to use the brush tool to do that. And what I want to do is add some highlights in the foliage, add a little bit of highlight up parts of the waterfall, but take it away from other parts. I'm going to locally, in essence, burn and dodge. So I'm going to turn on the overlay mask and make sure that auto mask is not turned on, and I'm going to start painting. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I want to add some intensity to this green, because it's going to kind of serve to frame the waterfall itself. Now I'm going to tap the O key, which will turn off the overlay, but it's still live. So let's go ahead and open that up a little bit. Watch what happens as we increase the exposure. I'm going to increase the contrast. I'm going to increase the clarity, and I'm going to increase the saturation. Now when I increased the contrast, I went a little too light. Just a little bit of flavoring. I think I'll bring the highlights down a little there as well. And I'm going to increase the saturation a little bit more. Great. That is adding some more interest in here. Now I'm going to hit new. I'm going to do another one. I want to take away your eyes from going up into this area. So I'm going to tap O to bring the overlay up again. And I'm going to just put myself a real quick, kind of think of it as a mask there. It's really just a selection. And I'm going to bring down the exposure of that area, which will have the effect of refocusing you onto the waterfall itself. Good. One more new one. Your eye goes to the brightest part of the image, and I kind of want you to focus on the entire waterfall rather than this area right here. So again, O to bring up the overlay, and I'm just going to darken this area just a little bit, again, just to keep your eye from just focusing on that. As I do that, you'll see a little bit more of the detail comes out. I will increase the contrast a smidge while I'm in here. I'm also going to make it a little bit bluer, so it'll blend in a little better. For some reason it went a little yellower there. It might have just been the way the light was hitting it. Great. One more. Now again, I'm going to kind of create a path of light up the waterfall. So I'm going to hit my mask overlay again, and I'm going to kind of trace along where we just were and add kind of a light path. This will allow you to lead very, very gently the viewer into this part of the image. So I'm going to hide that, and I'm going to open up the exposure just a little bit through there. It's very subtle, and after I've done it, you look away and look back at it. You can't even tell I did it, but it has an enormous impact on the image. Great. So that's done. Next thing I like to do is to go down to effects. I find myself using this post-crop vignetting almost all the time in my landscapes, and I'll just add a few minus points, somewhere between 9 to 11. Again, it's a subtle effect, but it has an enormous effect on the image because it keeps you in the center of the image. You can see as I turn this on and off, it's subtle, but it's a strong effect at the same time. And then lastly, under detail, I'll go check my sharpness. Alright, so I've got my sharpness here. I'm going to bring the sharpness up about halfway, but I don't want to sharpen necessarily the entire image. I don't want to sharpen these highlights here. It's just going to add some noise. So I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key, click on the masking slider, and the entire image turns white. Start dragging it off to the right, and you'll get to see just the edges that it's going to go ahead and do sharpening. So by doing this, I'm not sharpening the flowing water, but I am sharpening the small foliage. Perfect. Let's zoom out. And let's see before and after. Let me turn off this again. And what an enormous difference between this image and this image. And there it is. So that quickly, we went from that was the original file, cropped down to our video format, and enormous difference. It ends up being really a beautiful image. So let's do a quick edit on our original capture for our ad image that was again on the back of the Shutterbug magazine. And again, we can see we've got everything here. You can see, although if you looked on the back of the camera, this would look like it's gone. But if you look up here, right underneath the histogram, you'll see that as I put the cursor over there, there is data there. Nothing is blown out. And we can also see by the histogram that there's a gap between the last bit of data and that right-hand side. So we've captured everything we possibly could. We've also got nothing clipping because it's going right up to the edge. So it's a perfect histogram, but we just want to add a little bit more pizzazz back into the image. So one more time, let's go through the process. I'm going to bring down the highlights to take a little of the sting out of that white and bring in a little bit more of those details. Great. Shadows look good, nothing really needed there. I'm going to add some clarity. Again, clarity is a localized contrast. And I'm going to add saturation back in. That quickly, we've got our tonality pretty much where we want it. So the next step again, I'm going to go to Effects. I'm going to add a little bit of negative highlight priority on this post-crop vignetting. And again, you can see as I turn this on and off, it has the effect of keeping you centered in the image. And I'm going to add my sharpening. Again, I'm going to go about halfway up, and it does make it nice and sharp, but there's no need to sharpen that water, because if you do that, all it does is it has the effect of adding grain into it. We don't want to do that. So again, hold down Alt or Option, click on the masking slider, drag it over so that it is only affecting those little fine edges on the foliage. Let it go. It gets rid of the noise that was produced in this water, but it leaves the edges of our leaves nice and sharp. Adds that nice crispness, but it doesn't overpower the entire image and add a bunch of noise. So I can cycle through my choices here with the I key, and I see this was a 10-second exposure, 55 millimeters f22 at ISO 100. And there's our finished image. That's how quick the edit is. What the meter allows you to do is to protect those bright highlights, get the absolute maximum possible dynamic range out of your scene, get the most your camera has to offer, and it allows you to retrieve all that data back into your edit so you can get the most perfect landscape possible.
So here are the results. And that wasn't too difficult, was it? We took images where we trusted the meter to provide us the information to capture the greatest tonal range and knew that we could shape that capture into a great image. For any landscape and nature photographer, if you really want to capture the best data in tough or high contrast scenes, really the Sekonic 758 is really the best tool you can invest in. Now you understand, by the way, the green shirt. You get it? See how I kind of blend in? All right, a couple questions. Again, going back to the DTS software, when someone asked about their incident reading was 8 6/10, what do you set your camera to? You set your camera to f10. 6/10 is just a tenth short of 2/3 of a stop. So f8, f9 would be a third, f10 would be 2/3 of a stop. Here, somebody asked, to expose to the right, and this is the terrible word, why not just wing it and dial the exposure in until the blinkies disappear, the clipping indicator? As I said before, two things. One, the blinkies are based on a JPEG. We're trying to squeeze the most tonal range we can out of this capture so we can not only protect the highlights, but get as much shadow detail as possible. Since the blinkies are on the JPEG, they're not getting the full tonal range, and two, they turn on way before you've actually hit the edge. They're a safety margin, so yeah, you really can't trust them. Someone asked, does the 758 have all of the functions that the 478 DR has? No, it doesn't. They have some different feature sets that kind of gear them towards specific things. The 478's got more video and cine functions in it. It's got the ability to control the power levels of Pocket Wizard Mini and Flex from the meter. It's a great studio meter. The 758 has the 1-degree spot meter built in and all of the functions that go along with that in combining the readings of the spot meter with the incident reading. So for me as a landscape nature photographer, I want a 758. In the studio, yeah, sure, I'll pick up a 478 as well. Someone asked when I was at the falls, how often did I wipe my lens? There was quite a lot of spray flying. True, but I was careful as far as my position goes. I don't think I cleaned off the lens more than once. Rick was with me filming. Rick, yeah, maybe one time all day. I was just careful where I was, or I kept the lens cover on. Someone asked, is my camera set at matrix metering? It does not matter. It does not matter. I'm ignoring the camera's meter. 99.5% of the time, I'm shooting in full manual. I don't use the camera's meter at all, so it really doesn't matter what it's set for. Someone asked, why didn't I use the created profile at the shoot? Well, as you can imagine, I've created profiles earlier. I did have a profile loaded in already for my camera, so maybe I didn't use the one we created at the shoot, which was just demonstration purposes, but trust me, I did have the profile already loaded into the meter. Someone asked, so do you need to take a white balance of the color checker for reference in post-processing, not for just creating a custom white balance? If you're shooting raw, you don't have to create a custom white balance. It doesn't hurt, but because if you do it, by the way, that information will travel with the file into Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and it will already be set. That said, if I just took a picture of this target, I could use the sampler or the white balance tool and just choose any of these gray patches to set a white balance that way. In a raw file, the end result's going to end up being exactly the same. Another good question, someone says, so kind of to sum up, it seems that you only need to take a spot reading on the brightest part of the scene, right here in this white water. Again, the kind of the raging cascade over here. Make your adjustments to move the highlights to the right and then shoot. There would be no need to use any other meter readings. Under what circumstances would you not use this method of metering? We're going to cover that in a future session. Where I would go there is if I had a lot of shadow stuff that I needed to bring up the detail. If a shadow area was very important to the scene and I was losing it because it was beyond the tonal range from the highlight to the shadow, then I need to know that. And the meter can tell me that as well. Once I've got the meter with that exposure profile in there, I can take a reading of the highlight, I can take a reading of the shadow, and see if the shadow is beyond what the camera is capable of capturing in a single capture. If that's the case and I've determined that I need that detail, then I'll take a second exposure and I'll take it based on what the meter tells me. That's the next step, kind of HDRing or just taking a second exposure and then compositing them later in Photoshop. There are many times that your camera's internal metering system really does work beautifully, and it's a great idea to rely on it in situations that don't involve extreme tonal ranges like we see here. However, as soon as bright clouds, white water, snow, or sunlit white feathers make an appearance, I reach for my 758. I find that using a meter makes me spend more time evaluating the scene and watching what the light is doing. When this happens, I get better images. Now, there's a lot more that the Sekonic 758 can do, including, as I mentioned, telling you when a single capture might not be enough for the scene you want. We'll take a look at combining multiple exposures into single images, but still produce natural-looking results, just the way your eyes would see the scene. So that's it for today. I'd like to thank Sekonic for sponsoring us. They make it possible for us to be here. Learning to use a meter takes the guessing out of the equation and provides you with all the information you need for that perfect capture. You'll find the quality of your photographs increases along with your enjoyment of the places you visit because you got your shots and you're not going to have to spend all that time sorting through shots that did not work. I thank you all for watching. Thanks for the great questions and thanks for your interest and feedback. It's always welcome. So until next time, we'll send you a follow-up. It's going to be on Tuesday since we got a holiday weekend coming up. I'll also give you information. Hey, if you want one of these prints, I'll give you information to get one of those as well. So until next time, remember, first evaluate the light in the scene. Learn to use the tools that help you make that exceptional landscape happen. Till next time, again, thanks for watching. Be well. Bye-bye.